It was the kind of neighborhood you see in commercials: immaculate lawns, neat rows of houses, and a peaceful suburban hum. The kind of place where everyone waves, where everything seems perfect. To anyone passing through, it was just another quiet block in the middle of nowhere. But to Nathan Thomas, it was the kind of place that made him feel out of place. Nathan wasn't a typical resident of a sleepy town like this. He was a U.S. Marshal, someone who spent his days tracking down fugitives, dealing with dangerous criminals. He was used to chaos, to the kind of noise that came with sirens and the weight of heavy decisions. Yet here he was, sitting on the front porch of a house he had only recently moved into. A simple two-story home with a white picket fence. Nothing about it screamed danger. Nothing about it screamed excitement either. The neighborhood was a reflection of the calm he was trying to find after years of chasing down fugitives across the country. He'd taken the job in the suburbs to finally put down roots, to leave behind the constant hustle of city life. Maybe, he thought, this place would be different. Maybe it would offer the peace he longed for. But something felt off as Nathan sipped his coffee on the porch. His eyes scanned the other houses on the block. Neighbors waved from their driveways, children ran through sprinklers, and dogs barked happily. Yet there was something strange in the air, a subtle tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It started with small things: a quick glance from Mrs. Palmer across the street, who always seemed to be watching him just a little too closely. The young couple next door, who avoided eye contact when they walked past his yard. It was as if they all knew something he didn't, but it wasn't until he saw the first official-looking letter that the pieces began to fall into place. It was neatly folded in an envelope, stamped with an insignia he didn't recognize: HOA. A single sentence was printed inside: "Please be reminded to adhere to neighborhood rules regarding property maintenance." His grass wasn't perfectly trimmed, and there was a slight crack in the paint of his front door. He thought it was nothing, a harmless request, maybe even a mistake. But as Nathan read through the rest of the letter, something in the tone made his stomach tighten. These weren't just polite suggestions, they were demands. And as he set the paper down, his eyes locked with Karen Hayes, head of the Homeowners Association, standing across the street in her perfectly manicured lawn, watching him through her window. There was a strange look on her face, one that suggested she knew exactly who he was. It wasn't an expression of friendliness, it was more calculating, like she had already decided his fate. Nathan's gut told him something was about to happen. Something he hadn't planned for. He stood up, pushing the letter into his back pocket. The quiet of the street seemed to grow louder now, like a pressure was building, waiting to explode. But it was still just a feeling. For now, maybe I'm overthinking this, Nathan muttered to himself, taking one last look around. But as he turned to head inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was already on its way. And this was only the beginning. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when Nathan first crossed paths with her, Karen Hayes, the woman who seemed to have every corner of this neighborhood under her watchful eye. It started with something as trivial as the mailbox. At least, that's what Nathan thought. He had just finished trimming the front hedges, enjoying the rare moment of peace in his life, when he heard the gravel crunching beneath heavy footsteps. Looking up, he saw Karen, the woman who ran the HOA, striding across the sidewalk with that unmistakable air of authority. She was dressed in a perfectly pressed blouse, khaki pants, and, Nathan couldn't help but notice, shiny shoes that seemed a little too shiny for a Saturday morning. "Mr. Thomas?" she called out, her voice cool but laced with something Nathan couldn't quite place. He gave her a short nod, expecting a quick greeting. Instead, she continued with a deliberate step toward him, her sharp eyes scanning the yard with unnerving precision. "You've been here for a few weeks now, haven't you?" Karen asked, hands clasped in front of her like a teacher reprimanding a student. "It's lovely to see new faces in the neighborhood, but—" Nathan's eyebrows furrowed. "But what?" "I couldn't help but notice a few minor discrepancies with your property," she continued, pausing to adjust her glasses as if she were inspecting some fine print in a legal document. "Your mailbox, for instance, is slightly tilted to the left, and your lawn, well, it's not quite at the standard we expect here." Nathan blinked, a chuckle escaping his lips. "You're kidding, right?" Karen didn't smile. Her expression was as stern as her tone. "I'm afraid I'm not. These things might seem insignificant, Mr. Thomas, but they add up. If left unchecked, it could lead to a formal report to the HOA." Nathan stared at her, momentarily stunned. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and irritation. "I'm just getting settled in. A slight tilt on the mailbox, and some grass that's a little longer than usual? This is ridiculous." Karen didn't flinch. "It's about standards, Mr. Thomas. The HOA has rules for a reason. Everyone in this neighborhood is expected to follow them." Her lips curled into a thin smile. "You'd be surprised how fast things can escalate if you ignore them." Nathan exhaled sharply, trying to keep his composure. "Look, I get it. I'm not one to break rules, but this is a bit much, don't you think?" Her smile remained, but there was a colder edge to it now. "Rules are rules, Mr. Thomas, and I'm here to make sure they're followed." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." Something in her voice didn't sit right with Nathan. There was an undercurrent of something personal, something darker behind her words. It wasn't just about the mailbox or the grass. She was watching him, sizing him up like he was a threat. "I'll fix the mailbox," Nathan said, trying to keep things civil, his patience thinning. "But if you think I'm going to lose sleep over the length of my lawn, you're wrong." Karen's eyes gleamed with a satisfaction that sent a chill crawling up Nathan's spine. "We'll see about that. I'll be reporting it to the HOA first thing Monday. You should take care of it before then." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Nathan watched her go, his jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him even after she'd disappeared around the corner. This was just the beginning. He could sense it. He didn't know who Karen Hayes really was beneath that cold, controlling exterior, but he had a feeling he was about to find out the hard way. Nathan glanced down at the mailbox, now seemingly more crooked than before, and then to the yard. The grass, which had seemed perfectly fine to him, now felt like a battleground. He wasn't about to let her win, not like this, but as he walked toward the house, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the mailbox. It wasn't even about the lawn. It was the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd sized him up, as if she already knew something about him, something that made him a threat to her perfect little world. And that, Nathan realized, was the real problem, and there was no way he was going to let it slide. The letter came 2 days later. Not just any letter, but an official notice from the Homeowners Association. Nathan stared at the envelope in his hand, its crisp white paper taunting him with its formality. The kind of letter that made you feel like you were about to get caught for something you didn't even know you'd done. He tore it open. The words blurred for a moment, but then they jumped out at him, each sentence more absurd than the last. "Dear Mr. Thomas, this is a formal notice regarding violations of the Homeowners Association guidelines at your property located at 1348 Maple Street. The following issues require immediate attention. The paint color on your fence does not meet HOA specifications. Your lawn has not been adequately maintained, with patches of overgrowth present in multiple areas. The positioning of your mailbox has been deemed an obstruction to pedestrian traffic." Nathan's jaw tightened. The mailbox. Again. This was no longer about grass or paint. This was personal. He stood in the middle of his living room, the letter shaking slightly in his hands. It wasn't just a request to clean up his yard anymore. It was a threat, and the more he read, the clearer it became. Karen had followed through on her promise. She wasn't just a busybody, she was using the HOA as her weapon. And the most terrifying part? It was working. He dropped the letter onto the coffee table and ran his hands through his hair. It was the middle of the afternoon, and yet he felt like he was trapped in a fog of dread. His instincts told him something was off. Something about Karen wasn't right. He had seen the way she'd looked at him, sizing him up like a hunter waiting to pounce. As he stood there, pacing in the silence, his phone buzzed on the table. A text message from his neighbor, Pete. The man had been friendly enough when they'd first met, but there was an odd distance between them lately. Nathan had chalked it up to nothing. Now he wasn't so sure. Pete, did you get the letter from Karen yet? Hope you're not planning on fighting this. She's got everyone in line. Nathan's heart dropped. He quickly typed a response, but before he could send it, a new message popped up, this time from a number he didn't recognize. Unknown. You really think you can avoid the rules? She won't stop until you're gone. The text sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever it was, they knew something he didn't. And they were on Karen's side. His hand hovered over the phone. This wasn't just about petty rules anymore. The HOA wasn't some harmless group of neighbors trying to keep the neighborhood pretty. Karen had a network. She was playing a much bigger game than he had realized, and he was caught in the crosshairs. It was time to confront her. Nathan knew it wouldn't end with just the lawn. He'd seen her eyes, that cold, calculating gaze. She was taking it too far. His fists clenched as he walked toward the front door, still feeling the weight of the letter pressing down on him. He had to see Karen, had to look her in the eye and figure out why she was going after him like this. The walk to her house was agonizingly slow, each step heavy with anticipation. As Nathan neared her pristine white house, bordering on the ridiculous level of immaculate, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But he was done waiting. Done being passive. He knocked on her door, the sound sharp, against the quiet street. The wait felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. When the door finally creaked open, there she was. Karen Hayes, looking exactly as she had the other day, like she was in complete control, as if she had all the time in the world to make him feel small. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice polite but laced with something cold, something calculating. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm here about the letter," Nathan said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the anger bubbled under the surface. "I thought we could clear the air." Karen's lips twitched into a tight smile. "Ah, yes, the violations." She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "I'm afraid they're not up for debate, Mr. Thomas. The rules are in place, for a reason. They protect the integrity of the neighborhood." Nathan didn't move. "I didn't move here for this, Karen. You're going too far. These are insignificant problems. No one cares about the paint on my fence or the mailbox." Her eyes flickered, and for a moment Nathan thought he saw something different in her. A flash of something more than just the neighborhood enforcer. Something darker. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Oh, I beg to differ. The community cares very much about these insignificant problems. And as for your lawn, well, that's just the beginning, isn't it?" The way she said it, with that icy smile still on her lips, made Nathan's blood run cold. It wasn't about the lawn. It was about power, and Karen held it all in her hands. "You want me to fix everything, don't you?" Nathan's voice was tight. "Or you'll keep escalating this." "What's next, Karen? A fine? A lawsuit?" Her smile grew wider, almost predatory. "We'll see how you handle this. But trust me, Mr. Thomas, this is only the beginning. You'll be very sorry if you don't learn how to play by the rules." Nathan stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know what game she was playing, But he was certain of one thing. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore, and he wasn't about to be her pawn. Nathan's knuckles hit the door with a sharp rap, the sound reverberating in the stillness of the afternoon. He stood there, fists clenched, fighting the wave of frustration threatening to overwhelm him. The moment Karen opened that door, the conversation would take a turn. He wasn't going to let her hide behind her HOA mask anymore. The door creaked open, and Karen stood there, her posture poised, her face a carefully constructed mask of politeness. The same smile from the other day, cold, distant, calculated. It was as though she had been expecting him. "Mr. Thomas, what a surprise," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of mock sweetness. "What brings you to my doorstep? Today?" "I think you know why I'm here," Nathan said, his voice low but steady. "The citations. We need to talk about these ridiculous violations." Karen stepped aside, making a grand gesture with her hand. "Of course. Please come in. Let's have a civilized discussion about your minor infractions." Nathan hesitated. There was something about the way she said it, the way she looked at him, that didn't sit right. But he stepped inside anyway, the familiar smell of lemon-scented cleaner filling his nose as he followed her down the hallway. He'd expected a sterile environment. She was, after all, the kind of person who had every inch of her life under control. But he didn't expect the walls to be lined with photographs. Photos of the neighborhood. Photos of him. His stomach. Churned. "Sit, please," Karen said, interrupting his thoughts, motioning to a pristine armchair. "I'm sure we can work something out." Her voice was still sweet, but there was a sharpness to it now, like a predator toying with its prey. Nathan sat, though unease coiled in his gut. "I don't know how you can justify these citations. The mailbox isn't that big of a deal, and as for the lawn, it's just some overgrown grass. Nothing that serious." Karen's lips twitched, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the side, running her fingers over the top of a bookshelf, and then turned to face him, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice dropping slightly, as though she were speaking to a child. "You think these small things don't matter, but they do. They matter to me. They matter to everyone in this neighborhood." Nathan's brow furrowed. "What the hell is your problem, Karen? Why are you so fixated on my house?" She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her smile fading into something colder, more dangerous. "I know more about you than you think. Mr. Thomas, I know exactly who you are." His heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Karen leaned in slightly, her voice lowering even more. "You're a U.S. Marshal. I know you've got a background in law enforcement. You think I don't know how you got here? I've been watching you. Ever since you moved in." Nathan's blood ran cold. His pulse quickened. "You've been spying on me?" The words barely escaped his lips. "What do you want from me?" "Spying?" Karen echoed, almost laughing at the accusation. "I wouldn't call it spying. More like observing. You're not the first to move into this neighborhood with a past they want to keep hidden. But I know what you've done. I know your history. I know who you really are." Nathan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "What are you trying to say? That you've been keeping tabs on me this whole time?" Karen's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time he saw something raw, something unsettling in them. "I'm saying I've been watching, Mr. Thomas, and I'm saying that when I noticed you moving in, I took the necessary steps to make sure you didn't bring your problems here." Nathan felt the world tilt slightly. "What problems?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You were involved in a federal investigation years ago. The case was messy. People got hurt. Lives were ruined. I made sure you didn't. Leave that life behind." His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had been careful, so careful, to leave his past behind. But Karen had been watching, waiting. I don't know what you think you know, but— Oh, I know enough, Karen interrupted. Enough to know that you're not the upstanding citizen you want everyone to believe you are. You might have cleaned up your act, Mr. Thomas, but I'm not the only one who remembers. Nathan's mind was spinning, but there was one thing that cut through it all. One thing that stood out: the way Karen had said people got hurt. You called the cops on me, didn't you? He demanded, stepping closer, his fists clenched. Before I even had a chance to explain myself. Before I could do anything. Karen's smile widened just a fraction. I did. But don't worry, I didn't make the final call. You've been under surveillance long before you moved in. It's not just about the lawn or the mailbox, Mr. Thomas. It's about control. Nathan's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This wasn't some petty vendetta about a mailbox or a fence. Karen had been using the HOA as a cover for something far deeper, something personal, and he was at the center of it. You're not just a petty HOA enforcer, are you? He asked, the realization hitting him like a gut punch. No, Karen said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I'm much more than that. Nathan took a step back, his mind reeling. There was a deeper game being played here, one that had nothing to do with community rules. He was in over his head, and he had no idea how far Karen was willing to go to finish it. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Not after the conversation with Karen. Not after realizing just how far she was willing to go. The way she had twisted everything, using her HOA power as leverage, wasn't just about controlling the neighborhood. It was personal, and he was caught right in the middle of it. The sun barely crept over the horizon when Nathan heard the knock. It wasn't the kind of knock that would have made anyone else's heart race, but for him, it was the sound of everything spiraling out of control. Knock, knock, knock. Nathan froze. It wasn't the soft tap of a delivery person or a neighbor stopping by. It was urgent, demanding. It was the knock of a man with a badge. He slid out of bed quietly, trying to avoid waking Mia, his wife. She didn't know the full extent of what was going on. He hadn't told her about the texts, the letter, or the confrontation with Karen. He had been trying to keep her shielded from the mess, but now it seemed like it was here, at his doorstep. He peeked through the peephole, and his stomach twisted. A police officer stood on the other side, his face stern, his posture rigid. Behind him, a squad car idled at the curb, lights off but the engine still running. Nathan's pulse quickened. Who called? He muttered under his breath. He didn't need to ask the question. He already knew. The officer knocked again, this time louder. Nathan opened the door just a crack, his heart hammering in his chest. Mr. Thomas? The officer asked, his voice polite but firm. Nathan's stomach churned. Yes? His eyes darted quickly to the officer's belt, checking for the signs of a routine stop. Badge, gun, cuffs. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The officer glanced at his notepad before locking eyes with Nathan. We've received a complaint about a violation of neighborhood ordinances. I'm here to investigate. Nathan's mind raced. Karen. She actually called the cops. What kind of violation? Nathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer glanced at his notepad again, as though double-checking. It seems there's been a complaint about the structure of your property, specifically the color of your fence, overgrown vegetation, and something about the positioning of your mailbox. Nathan's jaw clenched, the absurdity of it hitting him again. He forced a breath, holding it in for a moment, trying to keep his cool. You're serious about this? The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning Nathan's face like he was evaluating more than just the situation. He was gauging Nathan, probing almost. Nathan felt the weight of it. This wasn't just about a lawn or a mailbox. This was more, much more. "I'm just doing my job, sir," the officer said, his tone neutral, almost rehearsed. Nathan's mind spun, his training kicking in. He was a U.S. Marshal, trained for moments like this, moments where tension could flip on a dime. He had to stay calm. He had to avoid escalating this. But at the same time, he knew Karen had crossed a line. And when people in power crossed lines, they didn't always stop there. "I'm happy to answer any questions," Nathan said slowly, trying to sound cooperative, but also leaving a subtle hint of authority in his voice. The officer paused, sensing the shift in Nathan's demeanor. The officer took another step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was trying to read Nathan. "We need to inspect the property, Mr. Thomas. I have to make sure everything is in compliance." Nathan felt a pang of panic, but he masked it. This was the moment. A moment where everything could go wrong. He could feel the tension building, the weight of the officer's presence growing heavier by the second. If he let this escalate, if he made a wrong move, just one wrong word, Karen would have exactly what she wanted. The officer stepped toward the yard, and Nathan instinctively followed him, keeping his distance. As they walked past the mailbox, the very one that had started all of this, Nathan tried to keep his voice steady. "Look, officer, I understand you have a job to do," Nathan said, his tone still measured. "But this whole thing is ridiculous. It's just a mailbox. Just some grass." The officer paused and looked back at Nathan, his eyes cold. "I'm not here to debate the rules, Mr. Thomas. I'm here to enforce them." Nathan exhaled slowly, keeping his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. He wasn't just playing this by the book. He was playing it by the only rule that mattered: survival. He wasn't about to make a scene. He wasn't about to give Karen the satisfaction. They reached the back gate, where the fence was painted a shade of gray that barely deviated from the neighborhood standard. Nathan watched the officer closely as he inspected the edges, his fingers brushing over the paint. He was scrutinizing every detail, as if the smallest imperfection could bring down everything Nathan had worked for. But Nathan didn't let the officer's behavior rattle him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back and nodded toward Nathan. "I'll have to report my findings. You're in violation of HOA codes. Expect a follow-up." Nathan's pulse remained steady, but his mind was racing. He'd avoided getting arrested, avoided the immediate confrontation. But this wasn't over. The officer's visit was just the start. Karen had just put him in a corner, and now it was his turn to decide whether he would fight back or let her destroy everything. As the officer left, Nathan stood in the doorway, his mind whirling with thoughts of what had just happened. Karen had crossed a line, and now the neighborhood would be watching. But so would Nathan. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Karen had made a mistake. She had called in the cops, and that meant Nathan had one card left to play. A card he was ready to use. And when the time came, it would be her mistake that would cost her everything. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Karen than he had initially thought. As the days passed, the pressure of the situation continued to mount. The cop, the citations, the constant surveillance. Everything felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. But Karen's behavior was too odd, too personal. There had to be something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. It was late when Nathan finally sat down at his desk, the glow of the computer screen casting long shadows across the room. He needed to know who Karen really was. His training as a U.S. Marshal had taught him that if you wanted to understand a person, you had to start by digging into their past. The first place he turned was the neighborhood database. Public records, old files, anything he could use. At first, it seemed like just another boring search. Addresses, names, sales history. But then something caught his eye. A case file. A name that didn't match Karen's but was eerily familiar. The name was Sarah Bishop. It wasn't uncommon for people to change their names, especially after they'd been through something unpleasant. But the moment Nathan clicked, On the file, he felt a chill run down his spine. The record was sparse, but enough details stood out to make Nathan's stomach tighten. Sarah Bishop had once been a security officer. No, not just a guard. She had been a high-ranking officer with a private security firm that had once handled government contracts. But that wasn't the shocking part. The file included a note from the department's internal investigation team. Dishonorable discharge following a failed operation in the South. Multiple charges of misconduct and excessive force. Nathan scrolled further, finding a news article from 5 years ago. It was brief, but enough to paint a horrifying picture. Ex-security officer involved in deadly incident was the headline. The article mentioned a botched mission in a foreign country, where Bishop, then a lead operative, had gone rogue during an undercover operation. The fallout was catastrophic. Several civilians had been caught in the crossfire, and multiple agents had lost their lives. The company had been forced to close its doors, and Sarah Bishop was never heard from again. Until now. The weight of the information hit Nathan like a ton of bricks. Karen, the meticulous, obsessive woman who had made his life hell over the past few weeks, wasn't just a neighborhood watchman with too much time on her hands. She had been a part of something dark, something that had ruined her life. And now she was using the HOA as a way to control everything around her. Nathan sat back, the chair creaking under his weight as the full scope of her obsession started to come into focus. Karen wasn't just targeting him because of some small violation. No. She was targeting him because of who he was. A lawman, someone from a world she knew all too well, someone she probably saw as a reminder of her past. He was a walking symbol of everything she had lost. A former officer turned disillusioned, dishonorably discharged, and now wielding her HOA power as a warped form of revenge. Every interaction, every seemingly trivial confrontation, was her way of taking back control, punishing those she viewed as threats to her fragile sense of power. Nathan felt a cold knot in his stomach. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Karen wasn't just some petty neighbor. She was a deeply broken individual, using her position to feel like she was in charge again. She wasn't going to stop until she brought him down, but Nathan had no intention of playing into her hands. The hours passed, and the tension inside him grew. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let Karen destroy him, or anyone else, because of her twisted vendetta. It was time to use his skills against her. He'd learned how to expose people like her, how to dismantle their carefully constructed facades. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to gather more proof, something that would tie her actions directly to her dark past. The next day, Nathan reached out to a few old contacts from his time as a marshal. He needed information, fast, the kind of information that could unravel Karen's life. A few calls and a few hours later, he had everything he needed. A copy of her old security records, the names of people who had worked with her, and even a list of incidents that had been scrubbed from the public eye. The truth was even more disturbing than he'd imagined. Karen, Sarah Bishop, had once been involved in a series of covert operations that had gone horribly wrong. But it wasn't just a one-time failure. She'd gotten progressively worse over time, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. Her obsession with control, as her former colleagues called it, had led to a catastrophic fall from grace. Now, with the HOA as her newfound empire, she was seeking to regain that power, to feel like she was back on top. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just about defending his home anymore. This was about exposing someone who was deeply dangerous, someone who had no boundaries. But as he pieced the puzzle together, one chilling thought crept into his mind. What if she's already watching me? He glanced toward the window. The blinds were closed, the house silent. But the nagging sensation that he was being observed never went away. And that's when he realized something else. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a war. one that Karen had been fighting for years. The only question now was, who would survive it? As Nathan prepared for his next move, he knew there was no going back. The battle with Karen had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined, and it was clear now. She wasn't just fighting for control of a neighborhood, she was fighting to reclaim her life, and she was willing to destroy anyone who stood in her way. Nathan had been planning this moment for days, every detail etched into his mind, every move calculated. The game was no longer about citations or petty grievances. It was about exposing Karen, Sarah Bishop, for what she truly was. A woman who had used the power of the HOA as a means to regain control of her shattered life, to exact revenge on anyone who represented authority. Tonight Nathan would bring it all to a head. But this time, he wasn't going in blind. He had learned to think like her, to predict her next move. His training as a U.S. Marshal had prepared him for moments like this. Moments where survival wasn't just about brute force, but strategy. And he was about to play the game on his terms. Nathan parked his car a few blocks down from Karen's house. He had done his homework. He knew she was home, knew she'd be expecting a confrontation. But he also knew she wouldn't see the trap he was about to spring. Taking a deep breath, he slipped out of the car and adjusted his jacket. He was playing a dangerous game, but the stakes were higher now. The evidence was in place, and tonight, he would expose Karen's web of lies. As Nathan approached her house, he felt the familiar tension building in his chest. The stillness of the night made everything feel more intense. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified. But he kept his focus. He had a plan, and it was time to execute it. He knocked on her door, calm and steady, his heart thumping in his chest. No turning back now. Karen opened the door, her eyes narrowing when she saw him standing there. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice cold and measured. "Back for more? I told you, your violations are a serious matter." Nathan forced a tight smile. "Actually, Karen, I think you're the one in serious trouble now." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that response. "What are you talking about?" Nathan stepped forward slightly, his tone low and calculated. "I've been doing some digging of my own. You didn't think I wouldn't figure it out, did you? Your little vendetta, your past. It's all coming to light." Her expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. He had her attention. "You really think you can intimidate me with your threats, Mr. Thomas?" she sneered, taking a step back and crossing her arms. "You've been a thorn in my side, but it's over now. You're not going to get away with this." Nathan's pulse quickened, but he kept his cool. "I already know what you've done, Karen. I know about your history, about the operation that went wrong, how you used the HOA to rebuild your power, to punish people who remind you of everything you lost. But that's not all, is it?" He could see the shift in her eyes. There it was, the first crack in her armor. He had hit a nerve. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, though the tremor in her voice was telling. Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know about the people you've been covering. 4. The board members of the HOA. They've been helping you cover up your little empire of corruption, the illegal activities, the shady deals. You think I wouldn't find out about that?" Karen's eyes darted to the door, as if searching for a way out. It wasn't panic yet, but it was close. Nathan held his ground, never taking his eyes off her. "You've been so careful, haven't you? But you underestimated one thing. Me." In that moment, Nathan's phone buzzed. He didn't need to look at it. The message was already on its way. He'd sent it to a few key people in law enforcement. A recording of his conversation with Karen, a full breakdown of her illegal activities, and a few well-placed details about the HOA board's involvement. It was over for her. She took a step back, her breathing shallow now. "You think you've got me, don't you? You think you've won. But you're wrong. This neighborhood, This power, it's all mine. You can't stop me. Nathan took a step forward. No, Karen, you're done. Just as she seemed about to snap, there was a sharp noise from the street, a car pulling up in front of her house. She froze, her eyes locking onto Nathan's, a silent warning flashing across her face. Her allies were here, no doubt, the corrupt board members she'd been working with to maintain control over the HOA. But Nathan had anticipated this. As the figures climbed out of the car, Nathan shifted his weight, adjusting his stance. He had one last move. Without looking, he tapped his phone and sent a text to the officers waiting nearby. The car doors opened, but before the people could even step onto the lawn, the sirens went off in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. Karen's face paled as the reality hit. It was too late for her to stop it. The trap had been set. "You think you've won?" she hissed, taking a few steps backward. "You think you're clever? Well, you don't know everything, Nathan. There's more at play here than you realize." Nathan's lips curled into a grim smile. "I know enough, Karen. Enough to make sure you never hurt anyone again." As Karen's allies were pulled from the car by officers, Nathan could see her breaking down. Her control, her empire, slipping away from her in real time. The facade she had spent years building crumbled before her eyes. But it wasn't over yet. Before she could respond, one of the officers stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. "Karen Bishop, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent." The words felt almost surreal, like the ending of a thriller movie. But Nathan knew it wasn't a movie. This was real. And as Karen was handcuffed, her eyes locked onto his, full of rage and disbelief. She had underestimated him. And now, as she was escorted to the waiting patrol car, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her twisted obsession lifting from his shoulders. He had won. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lingered in the shadows, waiting to rise again. The game was over. For now. The calm after the storm was almost surreal. The flashing blue and red lights, the chaotic arrests, and the mounting evidence that would soon make Karen's twisted reign come to an end had finally settled. Nathan stood on the edge of the front yard, watching as officers escorted Karen away in handcuffs, her face pale and contorted with a mix of disbelief and anger. The neighborhood, once quiet and idyllic, was now buzzing with activity. People who had once avoided him, eyes averted when they passed, were now watching the scene unfold from their windows or their front porches. They whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and, dare he say it, relief. Karen's twisted game had played out, and Nathan had won. Not with violence, not with force, but with patience, cunning, and the skills that came from years of service as a U.S. Marshal. As he watched Karen being driven away, Nathan felt a sense of closure settling over him. But it was bittersweet. He had played the game smartly, outwitting her every step of the way, but the emotional toll had been heavy. He hadn't expected the psychological weight of this petty neighborhood drama to consume so much of his time, to turn into something more sinister than a simple HOA dispute. The officers continued to process the scene, and soon Nathan saw one of them approach him, nodding in acknowledgement. "Good work, Marshal," the officer said, his tone respectful but low. "We've got enough evidence to charge her for multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. The board members she was working with are all implicated too." Nathan nodded, but he didn't feel the rush of victory he had imagined. The sense of triumph was there, sure, but it was tempered by something else, something deeper. He had won, but the fight had left him exhausted. It wasn't just about exposing Karen. It was about how far he'd been willing to go to do it. "You did what you had to do," the officer continued. "I'd say you could relax now, but Looks like the neighborhood's waiting for their hero. Nathan glanced back at the houses, at the eyes peeking through curtains and the small groups of neighbors standing at a distance. His presence here had shifted. He wasn't the outsider anymore, the odd neighbor who didn't quite fit in. Now he was the man who'd taken down the very person who had tried to ruin everything. But Nathan didn't want to be anyone's hero. He just wanted peace. "Thanks," Nathan said, offering a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll take it from here." He turned and started walking away from the scene, his boots crunching the gravel beneath him as he moved toward his house. The quiet suburban street seemed almost peaceful again, but Nathan knew the truth. There was no such thing as complete peace. There would always be something lurking just beneath the surface. As he passed his house, he couldn't help but glance over at the other homes, the neat little yards, the fences that were too perfect, the lawns that were too green. The neighborhood, with all its rules and regulations, had felt like a prison at times, like a world where no one was truly free. He had gotten caught up in that, in the petty power struggles, the little wars over insignificant things. And for a moment, he had almost lost himself. But not today. Today, he had kept his integrity. He hadn't resorted to violence or aggression, despite every urge in him telling him to. He had stayed calm. He had stayed smart. And in the end, that had been enough to take down someone who had reveled in power and control for far too long. As Nathan reached the front steps of his house, he stopped for a moment, taking in the sight of his front door. The calm was almost eerie, the stillness of the evening wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. He knew that this chapter of his life was over. Karen was done. The HOA was no longer her weapon to wield. The neighbors, now free from her reign of terror, would likely return to their quiet, predictable lives, each of them silently grateful for his actions, even if they never said a word. Nathan wasn't sure how things would be moving forward. Would they see him differently now? Would they treat him as the hero of the neighborhood? He doubted it. He wasn't the kind of guy who wanted that kind of recognition. He'd played his part, done what was necessary, and now it was time to move on. He stepped inside his house and locked the door behind him, the weight of the world finally easing from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe again. As he sat down on his couch, Nathan reflected on everything that had happened. How something as simple as a lawn violation had turned into a full-blown battle for survival. How, at times, he had nearly given in to the anger, to the temptation of using force. But in the end, it wasn't about brute strength. It was about outsmarting the enemy, understanding the bigger picture, and maintaining control. He thought about Karen, the way she had used her power to manipulate everyone around her, her obsession with control, and how it had ultimately consumed her. But Nathan couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She had been a victim too once, a victim of her own failures, of her own inability to let go of the past. In the end, she had destroyed herself. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was over now, and as much as he hated the way it had gone down, he knew one thing. He had maintained his honor. The neighborhood would never be the same again. But Nathan had emerged victorious, not through violence, but through integrity. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. As he leaned back on the couch, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, he allowed himself one final thought before closing his eyes. Sometimes, the quietest victories are the hardest fought. The battle was over, but life, as always, would go on. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.